Let me tell you something about humans. No, wait, let me start over. Because if I start with that sentence, none of you are going to believe what comes next, and I need you to believe every single word, because I was there and I still do not fully believe it myself. My name is Vreth Okalon. I am a senior field analyst for the collective armed forces of the Grenhari Dominion, which is a very impressive title that basically means I watch battles happen and write reports about them afterward. I have watched 41 documented engagements. I have seen entire fleets reduced to floating debris fields. I have watched planetary defense grids collapse in under 6 minutes. I have seen things that would make most species retire, find a quiet cave somewhere, and never come out again. None of those things prepared me for the day I watched one human male, armed with what our weapons catalog generously described as primitive ballistic projection devices, stand in the center of a closing encirclement of 237 Grenhari combat soldiers. Look around at all of them with calm, evaluating eyes, and then, he called it convenient. I am going to need you to sit with that for a moment. Convenient. The engagement began, as most bad decisions do, with someone being overconfident. That someone was Commander Brix. Brix was a decorated officer with an impressive service record, a jawline that made junior officers nervous, and the strategic intuition of a particularly stubborn wall. He was not a stupid creature, let me be clear about that. He was simply the kind of creature who, when presented with overwhelming numerical superiority, forgot to ask why the other side was not running. The planet was called Veth-Kaaro by our charts. The humans had a different name for it, something that translated roughly into New Settlement Grid 4, which tells you everything you need to know about how humans approach the poetry of naming things. They are a deeply practical species. They name things by what those things do, not by how those things feel, and I think that is the single most terrifying thing about them if you consider it long enough. Veth-Kaaro was a frontier world, mostly dry, scrubland broken by rocky outcroppings, the kind of terrain that looks simple from orbit but becomes a completely different conversation once you are standing in the middle of it, because suddenly every rock is a potential hiding place and every shadow is a problem. The humans had established a small research outpost on the eastern plateau. It was not a military installation. It was not strategically significant in any traditional sense. Brix had decided to take it anyway, primarily to make a point about Grenhari territorial claims in this sector. His plan was simple. His plan was, in fact, so simple that when he briefed it to his senior officers, 3 of them exchanged the specific look that junior officers develop after years of learning not to say what they are actually thinking. The look that says, I am going to write this down so that when the inquiry happens later I can prove I was standing right here and my mouth was closed. 240 soldiers, 14 atmospheric insertion pods, land in a ring formation around the outpost, establish a perimeter, advance inward. The outpost had a recorded population of 11 individuals. 11. Brix had brought 240 soldiers because, as he put it during the briefing, sufficient force eliminates uncertainty. He was not wrong about that, technically. He was spectacularly wrong about which direction the uncertainty would be eliminated from. I was watching from Observation Platform 7, which was a modest sensor relay station that Brix had parked in low orbit specifically so I could document this engagement for the record books. And by record books I mean the Dominion's official archives of military operations, which, for the first time in my career, I was genuinely considering filing under a different category than the one I was assigned. The category I was considering was, do not show this to enemies because it will give them ideas. Our pods landed on schedule. I watched them bloom open on my sensor screens like flowers, which is a deeply misleading metaphor because flowers are peaceful things, and what was crawling out of those pods was absolutely not peaceful. 240 Grenhari soldiers in full atmospheric combat gear, weapons drawn, establishing a precise encirclement around a cluster of prefabricated buildings sitting on a flat piece of rocky ground. Textbook formation. I noted it in my report. The spacing was excellent. The communication lines were clean. The ring was tight enough that nothing should have been able to walk out of it without being immediately identified and addressed. 11 humans were inside that ring. For approximately 4 minutes, nothing happened, which is already unusual, because in my experience when soldiers surround something, the something inside tends to react in some way. Panic, broadcast messages, attempts to negotiate, anything. Humans inside the outpost did none of these things. They just went quiet. The sensors showed heat signatures moving around inside the buildings. Calm, deliberate movement, not running, not hiding, more like tidying up, like people who had just been told guests were arriving and wanted to make sure things were in order. I noted this as Anomaly 1 in my report. Brix opened a communication channel to the outpost. "Attention, human personnel," he said, and his translator rendered it in clear standard. "You are surrounded by forces of the Grenhari Dominion. Deactivate all systems, step outside with no equipment, and submit to processing. Compliance ensures individual safety. Resistance ensures—" He paused for what I can only describe as dramatic effect. The alternative: silence. Then a single voice came back over the channel. "Hey, yeah, okay. Give me 1 second. 1 second. That was the response. Not a question, not a protest, not even a particularly concerned tone of voice, just a calm, almost casual acknowledgement, the way you might respond if someone knocked on your door while you were in the middle of something mildly important. "Give me 1 second. Brix looked at his communication officer. His communication officer looked at Brix. Neither of them appeared to know what to do with that sentence, which is understandable, because I was watching from orbit and I had no idea what to do with it either. The human who walked out of the outpost 30 seconds later was not what any of us were expecting. I want to be precise about this because my role is documentation, and documentation requires accuracy. What I expected was an unarmed, frightened researcher in civilian clothes, hands raised, expression displaying the appropriate level of being surrounded by 240 armed soldiers, which is to say, significant distress. What walked out was a man, mid-height, compact build. He was wearing something that our catalogs would classify as light tactical wear, which is a polite way of saying it was not armor exactly, but it was not nothing either. Dark in color, fitted in a way that suggested it was made to move in. He had 2 sidearms holstered at his thighs and something significantly larger strapped across his back, and he was carrying an open canteen of water, from which he took a slow, considered sip as he stepped through the outpost door. He looked around at the encirclement, 237 soldiers on the ground, because 3 had been redirected to secure the building perimeters. 237 weapons pointed at one man in the middle of an open flat space with nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. He nodded. Slowly, like someone confirming an appointment they had already checked twice. "Convenient," he said. I wrote it down immediately, not because I thought it was important at the time, because something in my analyst's brain, the part that has been trained to notice things that do not fit, went very quiet and very alert, the way prey animals go still right before something large moves through the grass nearby. Convenient. 1 man, 237 guns. And his word for the situation was convenient. Brix's voice came over the command channel, directed at his field officers. "He is unarmed enough. Take him." Now, unarmed enough is a phrase that reveals something about how the Grenhari military thinks about humans after the first couple of engagements we had with them in the outer sectors. We learned very early that completely unarmed was a category that required very careful definition when applied to humans, because humans have a deeply creative relationship with the concept of weaponry. A Grenhari soldier who is disarmed is disarmed. A human who is disarmed still has their hands, their feet, their elbows, their head, approximately 40 years of accumulated muscle memory, and most critically, their absolute refusal to accept the situation as concluded. So unarmed enough meant, he only has the weapons we can see, which, in retrospect, was doing an enormous amount of work for a very small phrase. 2 soldiers moved forward to collect him. Here is where part 1 of the documentation of my worst professional day begins in earnest. The man's name I would learn later through communication intercepts and the human emergency broadcast that went out before we could jam it was Dax Varro. He was, according to the broadcast, a senior research coordinator for the outpost. Research coordinator. I want to let that sit there for a moment as well, because when I filed my initial incident report, one of the reviewing officers asked me to confirm that detail 3 separate times because they were certain I had made a transcription error. Surely, they said, he was a military liaison. Surely he was some kind of combat specialist attached to the outpost for security purposes. Surely research coordinator was a cover designation for something more explicable. No, he was a researcher. He coordinated research. His official designation included the word senior because he had been doing it for a while, and I am told the humans give you a better title after you have been doing something long enough, regardless of whether the thing you are doing has anything to do with armed conflict. Dax Varro. Research coordinator. He waited for the 2 soldiers to get within 4 body lengths of him. Then he threw the canteen to the side, and the motion of throwing it was so casual that for exactly 1 full second, every soldier watching assumed it was the beginning of compliance. He was putting the object down. He was following instructions. That 1 second is all he needed. What happened next lasted approximately 40 seconds of real time and approximately 6,000 years in my memory. He did not run. That was the first thing I registered that made no logical sense. Running would have been the appropriate response for a single individual surrounded by superior forces on open ground. Running would have been understandable. Running would have been something our soldiers were trained to respond to, because running means the target is going away from you, and going away from you is something you can address with standard pursuit doctrine. He went forward. Into the soldiers. At the two that were approaching him specifically, and he moved with a kind of economy that I have only seen in recordings of Grenhari special engagement units, the elite fighters we train for a minimum of 6 years before we consider them ready for field deployment. That specific controlled way of moving where nothing is wasted, where every motion has exactly one purpose, and that purpose is being in a different position than the one you were just in while simultaneously doing something decisive to the person who was trying to stop you. The first soldier went down before the second one had processed what was happening. The second one went down approximately 3 seconds later, and Dax Varro now had 2 Grenhari combat rifles, one in each hand, and he was already moving sideways, not running, because the formation around him was too tight for running to be viable, but moving, constantly moving, using the fallen soldiers as brief shields while he created a new problem for Brix to deal with. Brix's problem was this. He had 235 soldiers surrounding one human, and that human was now armed with their own weapons, and the human was inside the ring. If you told me before that day that those words would become a sentence that described a strategic dilemma for a Grenhari commander, I would have politely recommended you seek medical evaluation. Contain him, Brix ordered. Advance the ring. The ring advanced. This is the moment where I need to explain something about Dax Varro's choice of the word convenient, because I spent approximately 15 minutes of the engagement not understanding it, and then I understood it all at once, and I nearly fell off my observation chair. He had wanted them to close in. The outpost behind him was not a refuge he had been cut off from. It was a position he had deliberately vacated because it was less useful to him than open ground with 235 targets arranged in a shrinking ring around him. An encirclement, from the inside, is not a trap, it is a target-rich environment. I wrote that phrase in my report, and then I sat and looked at it for a long time. Target-rich environment. That is the phrase that appears in Grenhari military doctrine when we are describing a situation favorable to our forces. We have never, in the entire history of our armed engagements, considered whether that phrase could apply from the other direction. Whether the thing we were surrounding might look at our formation and see abundance rather than threat. Dax Varro looked at 235 armed soldiers closing in around him, and saw an environment rich with targets. I noted it as anomaly too. Commander Brix had been in command for 11 years. He had run 23 engagements. He was not a man who panicked. He was, however, a man who had just realized that his straightforward suppression operation had become something significantly less straightforward. And that realization was visible in the way he was standing on the command feed. I was monitoring, which is to say, very still, in the manner of a creature that has heard a sound it cannot identify and is waiting to understand what made it. Squad leaders, converge, he said. Concentrate fire on the central position. His squad leaders did not immediately respond. This was because 3 of them were currently occupied with the fact that Dax Varro had moved through their section of the ring in the last 90 seconds, and moved through is the gentlest possible way I can describe what he had done, which was more accurately described as carved a path through using a combination of the 2 rifles, 4 improvised strikes with said rifles used as impact weapons, and at least 1 technique that our medical analysis team later classified as something humans call a leg sweep, which sounds friendly until you see what it does to Grenhari knee joint anatomy. He was not shooting, not primarily. He was moving. The weapons were extensions of the movement, and the movement was a problem that could not be solved by pointing more guns at the center of the circle, because he was not in the center of the circle anymore. He was at the edge, then he was over it, and then he was outside the ring. 235 soldiers in a perimeter. 1 human, who had just exited the perimeter from the inside. The silence on the command channel lasted 4 seconds. 4 full seconds where no one said anything, which in military communication terms is approximately equivalent to a geological age, because military communication channels are never silent when things are going wrong. Someone is always saying something. Orders, status reports, confused questions, something. 4 seconds of silence. Then a squad leader named Orville Sethan, who I would later nominate for a commendation specifically for the honesty of this transmission, said, "Sir, he came out." "I can see that," Brix said, in a voice that was doing an impressive amount of work to remain controlled. "He came out through Keth Squad's position. He walked out." Orville: "Yes, Commander. Tell Keth Squad to re-establish the perimeter and locate the target." There was another pause, shorter this time. "Keth Squad is currently unavailable, sir." I want to stop here for a moment, because this is the point in my documentation where the situation shifts from military engagement with complications to something that I am going to be asked to explain to increasingly senior officials for the rest of my career. 11 humans in the outpost. Dax Varro was one of them. Where were the other 10? I had been tracking the heat signatures inside the outpost buildings through the whole engagement. They had been calm, deliberate, moving around, not panicking. I had noted it, and I had attributed it to the possibility that they were scientists, and scientists, in my experience, have a specific kind of detachment that allows them to function during emergencies because their brains insist on understanding the emergency before they feel the appropriate emotional response to it. What I had not attributed it to, because it had not occurred to me to attribute it to this, was coordination. 10 humans moving with calm purpose inside a building while one of their colleagues walked outside to collect the attention of 240 soldiers is not panic. It is not scientific detachment either. It is a plan. Anomaly 3. I wrote it down. My hand was steady because my hands are always steady when I document things, because the alternative is acknowledging that my hands are shaking, and I do not document that kind of thing about myself. The outpost had 4 external exits, which I knew because we had the schematics. What I had not properly calculated was that an encirclement designed to keep things in is also, necessarily, an encirclement with specific weak points at the points between squads. The small gaps in coverage where the ring's geometry creates slightly less observation than the squad centers. Humans call these seams. 10 humans, moving in groups of 2, exited through 4 different seams of the encirclement at approximately the same time that Dax Varro was exiting through a 5th point and occupying the attention of approximately 60% of the ring's soldiers. 10 humans. Outside the ring, armed as it turned out with weapons I did not have on my schematics, which means the research outpost had a cache I was not informed about, which is a separate problem for a separate report that I also eventually filed. 10 humans outside the ring. 212 soldiers still in the ring, looking for one human who was no longer inside it. I want to describe what happened next with the kind of precision my role demands, and I want to be clear that I am not embellishing. I am not a writer. I am an analyst. I document what sensors show me and what eyes confirm, and what sensors showed me, and what my eyes confirmed during the following 14 minutes was one of the most tactically efficient things I have ever witnessed, and it was being done by creatures who, according to our intelligence assessments, were not even professional soldiers. 10 researchers, 1 coordinator, 11 humans, 212 soldiers, and a commander on a ship who was beginning to say things over the command channel that I will not reproduce here because they are not suitable for official documentation, and also because I have some respect for Commander Brix Tolova's dignity, even if he stopped having any respect for his own dignity somewhere around the 6-minute mark when he started repeating himself. Dax Varro reappeared on sensor 3 minutes after exiting the ring. He was moving through the scrubland to the north of the outpost, in terrain that was rocky and broken and deeply unsuitable for organized pursuit, which is almost certainly why he chose it. He was being followed by approximately 40 soldiers. 40 soldiers in broken terrain, pursuing a single target who clearly knew the terrain better than they did because he had been living on this planet for, according to the outpost's records, 11 months. 11 months of walking that plateau, cataloging geological samples, documenting atmospheric conditions, doing the incredibly specific and detailed work that researchers do when they are building a comprehensive picture of a place. What do you learn when you spend 11 months walking every inch of a landscape, where every rock is, where every ridge sits, where the ground dips in ways that are invisible from above but very relevant when you are moving through them at speed, where the sight lines are, where they are not? 40 soldiers pursuing one man through terrain. The man knew like the back of his hand, which is a human expression I have always found peculiar, but which in this context was devastatingly literal. I watched on sensor as the pursuit formation began to lose coherence. Not suddenly, gradually, which is almost worse, because gradual means you do not notice until the problem is already established and you are inside it. Soldiers losing visual on the target. Soldiers checking their formation and finding that the soldier who should be on their left is not where they expected. Communication fragments becoming more frequent, that specific quality of communication that happens when people are describing a problem that keeps moving. The target is not there. The target was just there. I do not know where the target is. Meanwhile, on the other side of the engagement, the 10 other humans were doing things that were individually modest and collectively devastating. 2 of them had disabled the communication relay that Brix was using to coordinate his ground forces, which degraded the command channel to something between difficult and nearly useless. 3 others had identified the 4 atmospheric insertion pods that were serving as supply points for the ground forces and had done something to them that my sensors described as compromised structural integrity, which in practical terms meant that if anyone needed to use those pods to leave the planet in the next 4 hours, they would find themselves having a very brief and educational experience with atmospheric re-entry. That left 5 of them engaging the main body of the ground force directly. 5 humans, 172 soldiers. The 5 humans were not engaging the soldiers the way soldiers engage each other, which is to say directly, linearly, in the manner of 2 forces that have decided to have an argument by standing in front of each other and shouting. They were engaging the way water engages rock, which is slowly, persistently, from unexpected angles, always at the point of least resistance, always retreating before pressure could be effectively applied, always returning from a direction that had not been defended yet. Hit and gone. Hit and gone. Over and over. I documented all of this with the specific calm of a person who has understood that they are watching something they will spend years explaining and who has decided that the explaining will go better if the documentation is thorough. At the 13-minute mark, Commander Brix made a decision. It was not a good decision, but I want to be fair to him and acknowledge that his options had narrowed considerably by this point. His ground force was functionally split into 3 groups that could not effectively coordinate. His insertion pods were compromised. His communication relay was degraded. He had lost 7 soldiers to confirmed incapacitation, 14 more to positions where they were effectively pinned by harassment fire, and his pursuit element in the northern scrubland had somehow managed to not only fail to catch Dax Varro, but had also managed to get themselves turned around in the broken terrain to the point where their position transponders were showing them 40 meters south of where they believed they were, which is a kind of spatial confusion that I did not think was possible for trained soldiers in an area of less than 2 square kilometers. Brix called for atmospheric fire support. This meant directing weapons from the ship in low orbit, specifically the platform I was currently standing on, to strike the northern scrubland and neutralize the pursuit complication. I want to note for the record that the moment he transmitted this request, the officer running our platform's weapons systems looked at me, and I looked at her, and we shared the specific silence of 2 people who have both just realized a significant problem but who are waiting for someone else to say it first. The problem was this. 40 of our soldiers were currently in the northern scrubland. Commander, I said, carefully, on the command channel, I need to flag a targeting concern. The target is in Grid 7 North. Analyst Okalon, provide fire support. Sir, our pursuit element is also in Grid 7 North. There was a pause. Then tell them to get out of Grid 7 North. Sir, the pursuit element's communication status is, then send a physical runner. Sir, the scrubland terrain in Grid 7 North is Okalon. Yes, Commander. Provide fire support. Support. I did not provide fire support. I want to be extremely clear about this for the record. I indicated targeting anomalies that made the engagement technically non-viable for atmospheric ordnance under our engagement protocols, which is a very precise distinction that took me 4 hours to explain to the inquiry board afterward, but which I maintain was the correct call, not only ethically but also practically, because if I had fired into Grid 7 North, I would have fired on 40 Grenhari soldiers and possibly not even hit Dax Varro, given his demonstrated facility with being exactly where you do not expect him to be. Brix relieved me of my station. His weapons officer declined to proceed without my assessment sign-off, because our protocols require it, and unlike some people I could name, the weapons officer had read the protocols. This is the moment where the engagement shifted from ongoing military operation to concluded military operation, outcome unfavorable. Because the 9 minutes that followed Brix's attempt to escalate were the 9 minutes that Dax Varro used to circle back around the scrubland, re-establish contact with the 5 humans who had been occupying the main body of the ground force, and then all 6 of them spent those 9 minutes doing something that our sensors could track but that I am still not entirely sure I understand the mechanics of. which resulted in the remaining functional ground force of 158 soldiers being organized into a very tight group in the outpost's central clearing. Not captured, precisely. Nothing as direct as that. More like persuaded. Over 9 minutes, through a combination of threats, positioning, the demonstrated fate of their colleagues who had attempted more direct resistance, and according to 3 separate testimony reports I received later, one specific moment where Dax Varro stood in an elevated position above the clearing and said something over a field communicator that translated roughly as, "This is the part where you all decide whether today is the day. I am ready either way. Are you?" 158 soldiers. 158 soldiers who looked at 6 humans, one of whom was holding a cup of what turned out to be hot liquid that humans consume for reasons I do not fully understand, and decided that today was in fact not the day. They sat down, on the ground, in the central clearing of the outpost. 158 Grenhari soldiers, sitting on the ground, surrounded, from the outside by 6 humans. I documented it. I sat on my observation platform and I looked at my sensor readout, and I documented every detail of it, and when I finished documenting I stayed very still for a long moment, because I am an analyst, and analysts process information, and the information I was processing was refusing to resolve into something my prior experience had prepared me to understand. The hot liquid, I learned later, is called coffee. Dax Varro was drinking coffee while 158 soldiers sat on the ground in front of him. He had made it before walking out of the outpost. He had known, when he walked out of that door, that he would be standing in approximately this position approximately this many minutes later, and he had considered that outcome worth preparing a beverage for. I wrote that down, and then I put my pen down and I looked at the ceiling of Observation Platform 7 for a while. Then I picked up my pen again, because I am a professional, and I wrote, "End of Preliminary Engagement Record, Part 1, continued in Part 2. Then I added one additional note, which I have never added to a report before or since, and which I am including here because accuracy demands it. The note said, "Personal observation." The human smiled when they surrounded him. He was still smiling. I do not think he stopped. Part 2, the part where it got worse. I filed my preliminary report at the 19-minute mark. I want you to understand what that means in practical terms. A preliminary report is the document that goes up the chain of command before the full analysis is complete. It is the document that says essentially, something has happened, here is the outline of it, details to follow. It is supposed to be a neutral, functional piece of documentation that gives senior command enough information to make decisions while the full picture is still being assembled. My preliminary report was 17 pages long. A normal preliminary report is 3 pages, 4 if things went badly, 5 if things went extremely badly, and there are casualty figures that require individual notation. 17 pages. I know what you are thinking. You are thinking, surely, Vreth, surely you padded it. Surely you were over-thorough because you were rattled, and when analysts get rattled, they write too much because writing too much feels like doing something useful. No, every page was necessary. I went back and reviewed it during the inquiry, and I could not find a single paragraph that was not directly relevant to the events it described. There was just that much to describe. That is the problem with documenting humans. They generate documentation the way some species generate offspring, which is to say, in quantities that seem unreasonable until you understand the underlying biology, and even then, it still seems like a lot. Senior Commander Praxis Holven received my preliminary report from his command station approximately 4 hours away by transit, read it in 12 minutes, and then transmitted back to me a single question. The question was, "Is this accurate?" I transmitted back, "Every word, sir." There was a 17-minute gap before his next transmission. In those 17 minutes, I sat on Observation Platform 7 and watched my sensor readouts, because the situation on the ground was not technically resolved, and my job was not resolved along with it. What was resolved was the immediate tactical engagement. What was not resolved was everything else, which, as it turned out, was quite a lot. Let me tell you about the other 10 humans. I have told you about Dax Varro, and I have told you what he did, and I want to be very clear that I am not diminishing what he did by shifting my attention to the others, because what he did was significant enough to fill the rest of my career's worth of case studies. But the other 10 are their own problem, and a problem that I think is actually more instructive about the species as a whole, even if it is less visually dramatic. The 10 researchers in the outpost were not combat trained. I know this because we obtained their personnel files during the engagement, because our intelligence unit was very thorough even when everything else was going poorly. And personnel files are the kind of thing you can pull quietly while the ground operation is busy generating 17 pages of preliminary documentation, not combat-trained. What they were was this: 1 geologist, 2 atmospheric scientists, 1 xenobiologist, 1 structural engineer, 1 communications specialist, and 4 research assistants whose specialties covered botanical survey, soil composition, water table analysis, and something called comparative tectonic mapping, which I still do not fully understand, but which apparently requires 11 months on a frontier planet and a great deal of patience. None of these specialties in any taxonomy I am aware of include defeating military encirclement operations. And yet, the geologist, whose name was Pelmoro, had spent 11 months identifying the exact geological features of the plateau that would create the most effective natural barriers to organized pursuit. The atmospheric scientists, Tak Udo and Seria Bren, had used their equipment to model the wind patterns in the scrubland with enough precision to calculate exactly how particulate matter would disperse under specific conditions, which in practical terms meant they knew in advance which direction smoke would drift, which is useful information if you are interested in creating concealment at key moments. The xenobiologist, Kale Drift, had documented the local fauna extensively. One of those fauna, a burrowing creature that lived in colonies beneath the scrubland, was extremely sensitive to vibration and expressed this sensitivity by creating a large amount of noise and surface disruption when startled, which was sufficient to mask the sound of movement through dry vegetation and also, apparently, briefly redirect the attention of 40 soldiers who were not expecting the ground to start moving and making noise beneath their feet. The structural engineer, Foss Yaren, had spent 11 months building and maintaining the outpost. He knew exactly which walls were load-bearing and which were not, which access points were on the official schematics and which had been added later for ventilation reasons, and precisely how the building's power systems were routed, which allowed him to do things with the outpost's lighting and electronic systems that were not in any manual, but which were very effective at producing confusion in people who were relying on their suits' threat detection sensors. Because threat detection sensors respond to electronic signatures, and when the electronic signatures in a building start doing things they should not be doing, threat detection sensors get very busy and very unreliable. The communications specialist was named Ziru Kane. Ziru Kane had not jammed our communication relay by accident. Ziru Kane had jammed it precisely, surgically, at the specific frequencies that Brix's ground forces used for squad-to-squad coordination, while leaving the command channel functional. This was not random signal interference. This was targeted disruption that created the specific effect of making soldiers feel connected to their command while being disconnected from each other, which is, I will note for anyone unfamiliar with military psychology, significantly worse than being disconnected from both, because disconnected soldiers who know they are disconnected adapt. Soldiers who think they are connected but are not spiral. Ziru Kane had known this. A communications specialist who had spent 11 months maintaining a research station's comm array in a frontier environment had known this. I documented all of it, every piece of it. I documented it with the specific mechanical thoroughness of a person who has stopped trying to emotionally process what they are writing and has committed fully to just making sure the words are accurate, because the words being accurate is the thing they can control. And then I got to the 4 research assistants. The 4 research assistants were named Baal Torv, Oren Saka, Ren Dul, and Lissadara. They were, according to personnel records, the most junior members of the outpost team. Baal was 23 years old in human age reckoning, making him the youngest member of the group. Oren and Ren were 26 and 28 respectively. Liss was 31 and was technically the most senior research assistant, which in the context of this story means she was the oldest person doing the most junior job, which happens at research postings for various reasons I will not digress into. 4 junior researchers. What they had done during the engagement, while their more senior colleagues were handling communications disruption and geological concealment and xenobiological distraction and structural manipulation, was this: they had, very quietly and very carefully, taken apart the 4 Grenhari atmospheric insertion pods that were serving as the ground forces' supply and extraction points, not destroyed them, taken them apart. There is a difference, and the difference is important. Destroyed things are clearly broken. You look at them and you know immediately that they are not functional, and you adjust your plans accordingly. Things that have been taken apart still look, from the outside, complete. They look operational. They have all their external components in place, and their indicator lights may even still be functioning, because indicator lights draw from a separate power reserve and can operate independently of the systems they are meant to indicate. It is only when you try to use them that you discover they no longer do what they are supposed to do. The 4 research assistants had removed 9 specific components from each pod, 9 components out of several hundred, chosen with the kind of precision that suggests someone had studied those pods specifically and deliberately and had identified the exact minimum set of components whose absence would make the pod non-functional for extraction purposes while leaving it externally identical to a functional pod. I asked, later during the inquiry, how 4 research assistants with no recorded military training had known which 9 components to remove from a Grenhari atmospheric insertion pod. The answer I received was that Baal Torv had a hobby. His hobby was, in his own words, taking things apart to see how they work. He had been doing this since he was, roughly, 6 years old in human age reckoning. He had spent the past 11 months in his spare time reading everything he could find about Grenhari military equipment in the open-access academic literature because he found it interesting, and because the nearest entertainment options were 11 months away by transit and he needed something to do in the evenings. He was 23 years old. He took apart Grenhari military equipment as a hobby because he found it interesting. I included this detail in my report. I was not sure at first if it was relevant. Then I decided that if anything was relevant to an inquiry into how 11 unarmed researchers had neutralized a military suppression operation, it was the detail that one of them had spent his evenings reading military equipment manuals as a leisure activity. Senior Commander Praxis Holven's second transmission arrived after his 17-minute gap. It said, "Status of ground forces?" I said, "Contained, sir. They are seated in the central clearing under observation." Another pause. Shorter this time. Maybe 8 minutes. "Contained how?" "Voluntarily, sir. They chose to sit down." The gap after that one was 11 minutes, which suggested Praxis was having some kind of experience that required 11 minutes to work through, and I respected that, because I had needed approximately that long myself at the time. His next transmission. "How many humans?" 11, sir. 14-minute gap. I used the 14 minutes to complete pages 11 through 14 of my preliminary report. When Praxis came back, his transmission was longer than the previous ones, and I am going to reproduce it here in full, because it is, I believe, the most accurate summary of the strategic situation that anyone produced on our side of the engagement, and it deserves documentation. He said, "Analyst Okalon, I am dispatching the Veth-class Rapid Response Unit from Station Mira. Estimated arrival 6 hours. I want you to maintain sensor observation of the engagement zone and document any further developments. I also want you to tell me, and I am asking this as your commanding officer and not as someone who is going to enjoy hearing the answer, whether in your professional assessment, sending another unit to that location is going to solve the problem or create a different one." I looked at my sensor readout. I looked at the 158 soldiers still sitting on the ground in the central clearing. I looked at the 6 humans moving around the outpost perimeter with the calm efficiency of people who had finished one task and were now organizing the next one. I looked at the scrubland where the 40 soldiers from the pursuit element had, over the past 30 minutes, gradually and somewhat sheepishly reassembled themselves into a rough formation and were now standing together near the northern edge of the clearing, not quite sure where else to go. I transmitted back. "Sir, in my professional assessment, sending a Veth-class Rapid Response Unit will solve the problem only if the unit is briefed on what happened here in considerable detail and approaches the situation with that full context in mind. If the unit is not briefed, it will attempt a standard suppression approach, and then we will be having this same conversation again in approximately 40 minutes, but with a larger preliminary report." Praxis's gap after that one was only 4 minutes, which told me he had already been thinking along the same lines. "Brief them," he said. "Yes, sir." "All of it?" "All of it, sir, especially the coffee." Another gap. 3 minutes. "The coffee?" "He made it before walking outside, sir. It was premeditated. I think the briefing should include that detail specifically." 6 minutes. "Noted, Analyst Okalon. While I was composing the briefing document for the incoming Veth unit, Dax Varro did something that I would not have predicted, even accounting for everything I had already documented about him. He walked over to the seated soldiers. Not in a confrontational way, in the manner of someone crossing a room to have a conversation. He moved through the clearing at a pace that was unhurried to a degree that I found personally offensive, given the context, and he stopped approximately 2 body lengths from the nearest seated soldier, a young trooper named Ket Vasov, who I know by name because Ket Vasov later gave a very detailed testimony about what happened next, and his testimony was so thorough that I actually felt guilty for not having a better sensor angle to document it from in real time. Dax Varro sat down on a rock, not standing over them, not pacing around them in the manner of someone asserting dominance over a captive group. He sat down on a rock, at approximately the same elevation as the soldiers on the ground, and he said in standard, which our soldiers could all understand, "Okay, you all want to know something I have been thinking about?" Ket Vasov, according to his testimony, did not respond because he was not sure if the question was rhetorical or genuine, and getting the answer wrong seemed like it had potential consequences. Dax Varro apparently read this in Ket's expression because he continued, "You landed on our plateau in 14 pods, in a ring formation, at 0400, which meant you were in transit no later than 0300, which means someone decided to run this operation before local sunrise, which is standard for surprise approaches, and I respect the logic. The problem is that this plateau has a wind pattern that shifts at 0230, and from 0230 to 0615, the atmospheric conditions create a very specific pressure differential between the plateau surface and the upper atmosphere." He paused. "Tak told me about it," he added by way of clarification. "Tak is our atmospheric guy. He has been measuring that pressure differential for 11 months. You know what it does to insertion pod approach trajectories?" Ket Vasov, at this point according to his testimony, said no because he was young and had not yet developed the veteran soldier's instinct for not engaging with the thing that is talking to you when the thing has demonstrated it is better at this than you are. "It shifts them by about 4 degrees, Dax Varro said. "You probably compensated for it in your navigation. You compensated well, actually. The landing pattern was tight, but the compensation meant your northern entry point was 6 meters further east than it was supposed to be." He took a sip of his coffee. "That is where we came out. Your seam. We measured it this morning when the pressure differential peaked." Silence. "We knew you were coming," Dax Varro said, and his voice, according to Ket, was not unkind when he said it. "Not specifically, not your unit, but we knew someone was going to come eventually, because this is a contested sector and we have been here long enough to matter to someone's territorial claim. Hal figured out the geology months ago. Foss went through the building plans and found the exit points. Ziru mapped your communication frequencies from your earlier passovers. We have been planning for this for a while." More silence. "I am telling you this," Dax Varro said, "because I think you deserve to know that you were not beaten by luck. You were beaten by 11 months of someone paying very close attention, and I think that is easier to sit with than the alternative." Ket Vasov wrote in his testimony that he was not sure if this made him feel better or worse, but that he had appreciated the sentiment. Then Dax Varro asked if anyone was injured and needed attention. 12 soldiers raised their hands. He stood up, put his coffee down on the rock, and spent the next 40 minutes providing medical assistance to the 12 soldiers who had been injured during the engagement, using supplies from the outpost's medical kit, because the outpost was a research station with medical equipment, and because, as he explained to Ket Vasov while wrapping a field dressing around a trooper's arm, he did not particularly want anyone to be in avoidable pain while they waited for the situation to be resolved. I documented it with the expression of a person who has run out of appropriate expressions and has defaulted to competence as a coping mechanism. The Veleth-class Rapid Response Unit arrived 5 hours and 52 minutes later, which was 8 minutes ahead of schedule, because the unit commander, a woman named Cossa Tren, had pushed transit speed after reading my briefing document. I know she pushed speed because of the briefing, because she told me so, directly, on a secure channel, approximately 30 minutes before arrival. "Analyst Okalon," she said. "Commander Tren, I read your document." "Yes, sir. I read it twice." "I would expect that, sir." "The part about the coffee." "Yes, sir. He made it before going outside." "Before walking outside?" "Yes, sir." "The heat signature of the brewing equipment is in my sensor logs. I can timestamp it precisely if that would be useful for the briefing." A pause. "Please do," she said. The timestamp showed that Dax Varro had started the coffee brewing approximately 9 minutes before walking out of the outpost to face 240 soldiers. This meant he had brewed it, waited for it to finish, poured it, and then walked out because the coffee was already in his hand when he appeared on sensors outside the door. He had waited for the coffee. He had not walked out while it was still brewing and come back for it. He had waited for the entire process to complete, and then he had picked it up, and then he had gone to deal with 240 soldiers. Commander Cossa Tren, upon receiving this timestamp, said nothing for approximately 45 seconds. Then she said, I am going to approach this differently than Commander Talova did. I would strongly recommend that, sir. I am going to open a communication channel to the outpost before any of my units land. An excellent decision, sir. And I am going to be honest about the situation. I paused. Sir, we are in a contested sector. They have demonstrated the ability to defend their position. Continuing to throw forces at this outpost is going to produce the same results Talova got. Scaled up, and I have read enough of your report to know that scaling up does not seem to work the way it should with these people. She paused. These 11 people. I want to be clear that I am aware that we are talking about 11 people. 11, yes, sir. 11. The youngest is 23, sir. His hobby is taking apart military equipment. A very long pause. Okalon, sir. Why are you telling me these things? Because you told me to brief you on all of it, sir. I did say that. You did. Another pause. Fine, Cossa said. Connect me to the outpost channel. The conversation between Commander Cossa Tren and Dax Varro is, I believe, one of the more remarkable pieces of recorded communication in the Dominion's operational archives, and I am including a summarized version of it here because it is directly relevant to the outcome of the engagement, and because my documentation would be incomplete without it. Cossa opened with, This is Commander Cossa Tren, Grenhari Dominion Rapid Response. I am in transit to your location. I have read the account of what happened in the previous engagement. I am not approaching this the same way. Dax Varro said, Okay, what way are you approaching it? I would like to have a conversation before anyone lands anywhere. A pause. Then, that is a good instinct. What do you want to talk about? The soldiers in your clearing. They are fine. I patched up the ones who needed it. They have been given water and told they can stand up whenever they want. Most of them are still sitting, which is their choice. I see that on sensor. Smart of you to have sensors running. We try. Your predecessor did too, Dax said. He used them to try to call fire support on his own people. I want to flag that as a thing that happened, for the record. A pause. It is flagged. Good. Mr. Varro, I have a proposal. Let me hear it. I am authorized to offer a negotiated withdrawal. Our forces leave the planet. Your outpost continues its research. We establish a formal communication protocol for this sector, so that the next time someone in my chain of command gets a territorial idea, there is a process for discussing it before people start getting surrounded. The pause before Dax responded was long enough that I found myself holding a stylus I was not writing with, and then noticing I was holding it and putting it back down. I want the insertion pods returned, Dax said. The ones your team dismantled. The components are in storage in the outpost. They can be reassembled. They are yours. I just need them off my plateau. Done. I also want a copy of the atmospheric data that your sensor relay collected while it was parked in orbit. Our instruments only read from the surface. Your orbital position would have given you readings we cannot replicate from down here, and TAC has been trying to complete his pressure differential model for 6 months. A very long pause. You want our sensor data, Cossa said. For your research. It would take you 30 seconds to export it. It would take TAC another 6 months to collect it from the surface, and by that point you might send someone else down here and we would be having this conversation again. That is a reasonable point. I know, Mr. Varro. Yeah. You were a researcher. I am a researcher. Still am. How are you? How do you? A pause. Your personnel file says research coordinator. It does. Not combat. Not combat, no. But you, people are complicated, Dax Varro said pleasantly. Pell can tell you about 11 different types of rock formation from 100 meters away. Syria can look at a cloud pattern and tell you what the atmospheric pressure was doing 6 hours ago. Everyone here is very good at their specific thing. My specific thing happens to be a little broader. What is your specific thing? Exactly. A pause. Then solving problems. When something goes wrong, I figure out how to make it not wrong anymore. That is the job, really, even before the title. Something breaks in the field, and you are 11 months from the nearest support. You learn to fix it. Something shows up on the plateau that was not in the original survey plan. You adapt. Something sends 240 soldiers to surround your outpost. Another pause. You figure out what the problem actually is, and then you fix it. Were we the problem? No, Dax said, and his tone, according to the recording, was entirely genuine. The problem was that someone in your organization made a territorial claim without knowing what was on this plateau and then tried to enforce it without knowing who was here. You were the result of the problem. I addressed the result so there was space to address the actual problem. Silence. Which is why you are calling, he added. More silence. Yes, Cossa said, which is why I am calling. The negotiated withdrawal took 4 hours to process. During those 4 hours, I completed my preliminary report, bringing it to 22 pages, and began outlining the full analysis that would eventually reach 47 pages and require 3 separate addenda for new information that kept arriving after I thought I was done. During those 4 hours, Brix sat in the command center of Observation Platform 7 and did not speak to me, which I respected, because I did not have anything to say to him that would have been useful, and I think he knew that, and I think some part of him was grateful for the silence. During those 4 hours, the soldiers in the clearing were given food from the outpost stores, because Dax Varro had apparently decided that if they were going to be there for another 4 hours, they might as well not be hungry, and the outpost had enough to share. This is the kind of decision that I think reveals something about him that the rest of his actions during the engagement also reveal, which is that at no point was this personal. He did not want them hurt. He wanted them to leave. The tactics he used were designed to create the conditions for them to choose to leave, and once they had chosen, he treated them the same way he would have treated anyone else. It is possible this is more frightening than the tactics themselves. I noted this in the report. Brix eventually said something to me, in the final hour of the withdrawal process. He walked over to where I was sitting at my documentation station, and he stood there for a moment, and then he said, "You think they planned all of it?" I said, "Yes, sir. From the beginning. From some time before our arrival. Yes. Possibly months before." He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked out there like it was nothing. "He had coffee, sir." Brix looked at me. "He had made coffee," I said, before walking out. He had calculated the timeline well enough to know he had time to wait for coffee to brew before the situation required his attention. Brix was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "What kind of man does that?" I considered the question. I considered it with the full weight of everything I had documented, every sensor reading and testimony and personnel file and communication transcript, and I thought about Dax Varro sitting on a rock at the same height as the soldiers he had just neutralized, asking who needed medical attention, and I thought about him asking for atmospheric data for a researcher who had been trying to complete a model for 6 months, and I thought about him saying that his specific thing was solving problems. "I think," I said, carefully, "the kind of man who has been paying very close attention for a very long time, and who decided at some point that if something was going to go wrong, he was going to have a plan, and if the plan worked, he was going to have coffee." Brix looked at the sensor screen, where the withdrawal was in progress, soldiers filing back toward the reassembled pods, the humans standing near the outpost door watching with the calm patience of people who had already moved on to thinking about what they needed to do next. "And if the plan did not work?" Brix asked. I thought about it. "I think he would have made more coffee," I said. The Veth unit completed its withdrawal at exactly 1 hour before local sunset. The atmospheric insertion pods lifted without incident, because Baal Torv had, true to Dax Varro's word, provided all 9 removed components from each pod, neatly bagged and labeled by pod number and component function, with handwritten notes on reassembly and standard, which the Veth unit technicians described as unexpectedly thorough and somewhat unnerving in its specificity. The sensor relay in orbit was decommissioned, and its data, including TAC-UDO's pressure differential readings, was exported and transmitted to the outpost as agreed. I watched the last pod clear the upper atmosphere on my sensor screen. Then I sat in the quiet of Observation Platform 7 and I reviewed my documentation one more time from the beginning, and I tried to find the moment where things had gone wrong for us. The single decision point where a different choice would have produced a different outcome. The variable that, if changed, would have changed everything. I could not find it. Not because the documentation was incomplete. Because the problem was not a single decision. The problem was that 11 humans had spent 11 months turning a research outpost into something that was not a fortress exactly, but was not a fortress either, in the way that some things look like one thing and function as another, and we had walked into it looking for 11 frightened researchers and found 11 people who had decided at some point that frightened was not going to be particularly useful and had gone with prepared instead. Dax Varro had been prepared. He had been so prepared that he had coffee. I sent my completed preliminary report to Senior Commander Praxis Holven, and I attached a personal note, which I have never done before in my career and have not done since, because personal notes on official documentation are not protocol, and I am a protocol-observant analyst by nature and training. The note said, "Sir, I believe the Dominion's intelligence assessment of human populations on frontier settlements requires significant revision. Current assessments classify these populations as low threat, low resistance, and strategically negligible. I recommend reclassifying them as follows. Low threat, still accurate, in the sense that they are not actively threatening us. Low resistance, inaccurate. Strategic negligibility, catastrophically inaccurate. I paused. Then I added, also, sir, I recommend that any future engagement planning that involves human settlements include, as a standard intelligence step, determining how long those humans have been in that location. In my assessment, every month they are somewhere is roughly equivalent to one additional problem we did not know we had. Praxis responded, 3 hours later with, noted, Analyst Okalon, begin full analysis documentation. And then, after a gap, a second message that I will admit I have kept a copy of, because it is the first time a senior commander has ever sent me something that was not strictly operational. It said, also, the coffee detail. Do not leave that out of the full report. I want it in there, with the timestamp. My full analysis was 47 pages, 3 addendo, filed 16 days after the engagement. It is, as of the current date, required reading in the Dominion Strategic Planning Division for anyone involved in frontier engagement assessment. The cover page has the engagement designation, the date, the location, and the involved parties. Below all of that, I added one line that my supervisor initially told me to remove, and then, after reading the full report, agreed to leave. It said, subject note. The human called it convenient. He was correct. I have been asked, in the years since that engagement, what I took away from it, what the lesson was, what the thing to understand is, about humans, about encounters with them, about what it means to stand across from a species that has developed the particular combination of stubbornness and preparation and calm that Dax Varro demonstrated on that plateau. I always give the same answer. The lesson is not that humans are dangerous. Lots of things are dangerous. The Dominion knows how to handle dangerous. We have protocols and units and weapons assessments and tactical doctrines specifically designed to address dangerous. The lesson is that humans are inconvenient. Not in the way Dax Varro meant it, although he meant it brilliantly and I respect the precision of it. Inconvenient in a larger sense. They do not fit the categories, they do not behave according to the assessments. They spend their evenings reading equipment manuals as a hobby and then use that knowledge 11 months later at exactly the moment it becomes relevant. They brew coffee before walking out to face overwhelming odds. They sit on rocks at the same height as the people they just neutralized and ask who needs medical attention. They are inconvenient because they refuse to be only one thing. A researcher who is only a researcher. A coordinator who is only a coordinator. A scientist who is only a scientist. Those are categories the Dominion knows how to plan around. 11 researchers who are also, quietly, competently, unhurriedly, everything else that their 11 months on a dry plateau required them to become. That is a different situation entirely. I filed my last addendum to the report, 14 months after the engagement, when the Dominion's strategic reassessment of frontier human settlements was formally adopted as policy. The addendum was 2 sentences. It said, for the record, the outpost on Veth-Kaaro is still operational. Takudo completed his pressure differential model. Somewhere on that plateau, right now, 11 people are doing their work. Pell is reading rocks. Saria is reading clouds. Tak is reading pressure gradients that are now finally fully documented. And somewhere in that outpost, I am fairly confident, there is a coffee machine, brewing, ready, just in case.